Welcome back to Workshop Wednesday. I'm Chelsea Busmeyer and thanks for joining me today in my workshop. And this week I have just a really quick tip for you, actually 3 tips. My top 3 tips for working with chiffon. And I don't know if you've ever worked with these lovely flowy fabrics, but with summer coming up and kimonos and that kind of just like flowy jackets and overlays, you may want to branch out and try working with something like a chiffon or another really flowy fabric and make yourself some nice pieces for summer weather. I'm actually working on a chiffon dress right now for a graduation gown in this gray chiffon actually, and so it just kind of made me think that maybe I should give you guys a few tips for working with chiffon. And really the most important thing that I can say when you start a chiffon project or a really flowy, slippery material is take time with this project. The number one thing that causes me to need to unpick a chiffon project is if I'm trying to force it and go too quickly through it. So don't start a chiffon project unless you have a little bit of extra patience and a little extra love for it. Now, that being said, I have a couple more practical tips for you as well. The next tip is when you're cutting out chiffon, you need to be really careful that you don't have your material skewed in any way. Now, this is always important when cutting out material, but it's especially important for chiffon for a couple of reasons. The number one being because it's such a loose weave, there's a little bit of space in between where the threads are actually interlocking in the weave. It's very easy for it to have a slight skew even throughout the piece, not just at where it folds and where the selvage edge lines up or the edge of your material lines up. It can also have kind of skews throughout. So making sure that it is really nice and square, that the up and down threads are laying really nice and square to the cross threads when you lay your material out and cut your pieces will be so important later on in the project. This will be the number one thing that will help you piece the actual pieces of your garment together easier. If there is a slight skew, then when you take up the pieces and you try and match up the seams that need to align, they'll be kind of twisted and off, and some pieces will be longer, and it'll be just really difficult to get those pieces to sit nicely together and then to close seams without any kind of puckering happening. My last tip I wanted to show you on a seam that's already closed. Now this seam is laying really nice and smooth on the table, as well as when I hang the garment. And this is a perfect example of a seam that is cut a little bit on the bias. So varying amounts on the bias. Whenever you have a seam that goes kind of crossway through the material, so this skirt is a flaring skirt, so it is kind of an A line, so it's continuously flaring along the whole side seam of this skirt, you have the tendency that even if the pieces are cut square, if one piece is cut at a sharper diagonal or more bias than the other one, it will hang out longer. So even though you've cut it square and the seams should line up according to the pattern, the material itself may drape out longer. So if we force it to attach to the same length of seam on a piece that's not quite as diagonal, the seam itself isn't going to hang out the same. The piece that has less bias to it will stay shorter and won't drape out as long. So this is just a problem because it will cause puckering kind of like this. So if this was the more diagonal piece, it would go into the seam in some ruffly, puckery kind of folds, which aren't very attractive, obviously. So the only way to really compensate for that is when you're actually piecing the garment together. If you find that after you've closed the seam, it's not hanging straight like this one is laying on the table, but you do have those puckers, is unstitch that seam past those puckers and just hold it up and let it drape out. And what you'll find is that the more bias cut piece will hang out a little bit longer. So typically when we cut pieces and we know that they're the right length, we'll also want to attach them that way. But on a flowy chiffon piece, sometimes it is better to let that extra length just hang out to the hem and then just trim the bottom to match up again after you've closed the seam and you know the seam is actually going to lay nice and smooth. This is not something that we typically do on pattern pieces. If the seam edge lines up to the other seam edge, we usually want to keep that material to the original length. However, for the sake of a nicely closed seam and less puckers, which is also our ultimate goal when sewing, it is okay on occasion, and especially in the scenario of a chiffon or a flowy, looser weave material cut on a bias, to let those edges just hang out a little bit and trim up your pieces to match as you go. Now, this is just a little bonus tip since I have this piece on the table. I love the rolled hem. I do talk about the rolled hem quite often in different posts and that kind of thing, but if you've never learned to use a rolled hem foot or attachment for your sewing machine, I highly recommend it, because this is a simple rolled hem stitch just one singular time, and especially on light flowy materials, it's just such a beautiful finish if you want to make a scarf, or again like a kimono, or any type of little girl's summer dress. It's just a beautiful finish to get a nice clean edge without adding any kind of weight to the drape or the flow of your material. That wraps up this mini episode of Workshop Wednesday with my top 3 tips for working with chiffon. Now, if you have a sewing project on the go and you're stuck, or you don't know where to go, or you have a question about fabric or anything to do with sewing, I'd love to hear about it. So just post it under this video, send me an email, and I'd love to feature your question on an episode of Workshop Wednesday in the near future. Till then, take care, and we'll see you next week.